Hey guys, Jin here, and this is my endgame build slash guide for Frozen Orb. It clears trash and elites fast, doesn't require Ubers for the core build to function, it's satisfyingly spammable, easy to gear for, and if you're a long time Diablo player like me that remembers the good old days, there's a little bit of nostalgia. Anyway, a couple of downsides. The positioning and aiming are slightly more important than with Ball Lightning or Blizzard for max damage, and you have less 100 to 0 power for those big bosses like Lilith and Duriel, although still enough to get the job done in comparable time, especially for Lilith, thanks to her platform breaking phase. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the build, I'd like to ask that if you enjoy these guides, or they're helpful in any way to you, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell, as it helps out a lot. Thank you. Now to the skills. We're going to take 2 into Firebolt, then we're going to come down here to our core skills, and take 5 into Frozen Orb of course, and we're going to go for Greater Frozen Orb, although if you have a lot of mana issues at the start trying to collect the gear for this build, then you could slot in Destructive Frozen Orb to help out with that. We're going to take 1 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance, 1 into Flame Shield, 5 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and we're going to go for Mystical Ice Armor. Then we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, and go for Summoned Ice Blades, then 1 into Align the Elements, for the 3 into Mana Shield, and the 3 into Protection. Then we're going to take 1 into Blizzard, and go for Wizard's Blizzard. We want that for the mana cost reduction on our Frozen Orb. And then we're going to take 1 in Inner Flames, to get the 3 in Devouring Blaze. Then in our ultimate skills, we're just going to take all of the passives here for our cold skills. So we're going to take 3 into Permafrost, 3 into Hoarfrost, 3 into Frigid Breeze, and 3 into Icy Touch. And for our key passive, we're going to be using Esu's Ferocity. So that's it for the skills, let's move on to the Paragon board. So starting with the first board, we're going to put in the Winter Glyph. That's going to give us 125% bonus to all rare nodes within range, but also whenever we chill or freeze an enemy, we deal 3% increased cold damage for 10 seconds, up to 15%. Alternatively, you can use the Tactician Glyph here for the same bonus to all rare nodes, but instead, the additional bonus will be you deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. For our second board, we're going to be using the Icefall board. Make sure to take the legendary node. Our frost skills will deal 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, doubled if the enemy is also frozen. And for the glyph, we're using Unleash, so that's going to give us 150% bonus to all magic nodes within range. And in this case, it's a lot of damage to chilled enemies and damage reduction from chilled enemies. Additionally, after spending 50 mana, we deal 7% increased damage, and gain 7% mana regeneration for 3 seconds. Our third board is going to be the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist glyph here. So our Paragon nodes within range gain 75% bonus to their non-physical damage and damage reduction modifiers. Additionally, dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, and that stacks once per element. For our fourth board, we're going to go up here to the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Control Glyph, and that's going to give us a lot of damage to CC'd enemies. But also we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or instead 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. Then for our fifth board, above the Icefall board, we're going to put in the Ceaseless Conduit board, and the Destruction Glyph, for all that additional critical strike damage. as well as getting the bonus of critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, and that stacks up to 12%. For the 6th board, we're going to put in the Frigid Fate board and make sure we get the legendary node here. So we deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 10% of the total amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to a maximum of 30%, of which we have 27%. As for the glyph, we're going to use Flame Feeder here to get the increased damage to burning enemies, and also 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. For our last board, which will be to the left of the Burning Instinct board, we're going to use the Searing Heat board, and slot in the Exploit glyph here for the extra vulnerable damage, as well as dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. So that's it for the Paragon board. If I went a bit fast there, don't forget all of this will be in the build planner in the description below, and that will have the skills, the gear, the construct, Paragon board, and everything else to do with the build. So make sure you check that out so you can go at your own pace. Next up we have the enchantments. So for the enchantments, we're going to be using the Frozen Orb enchantment. So whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And we're going to be using the Firebolt enchantment for our second enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies up to an additional 26% burning damage over 8 seconds, which is great for our damage reduction to burning, as well as to activate our Flame Feeder glyph. So for the Seneschal construct, the Tempest Governing Stone is going to be our first Governing Stone, and we're going to put in the Breaking support, Efficiency support, and the Arcing support. Now if you happen to have the Evernight Tuning Stone, then you would use that in place of Arcing support. For our second Governing Stone, we're going to be using Flash of Adrenaline. And for our Tuning Stones, we're going to be using Tactical support, Duration support, and Initiative support. And if you happen to have Genesis, you would use that in place of Initiative support. Now for the gear, on the left side of the screen I'll be listing the affixes you want from best to worst if you don't have a unique item. So starting with the helm, we're going to be using a Godslayer crown. That's going to give us a lot of extra damage, crowd control duration, max life, and cooldown reduction. But also, we get this unique aspect, which is when we stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite enemy, or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies, and we also deal 60% in my case, multiplicative increased damage to them for 3 seconds, and this can occur every 12 seconds. So if you don't have access to a Godslayer crown, then you would use a helm with total armor percent, cooldown reduction, max life, and intelligence. If you can't get those, look for all stats or crowd control duration. And as for the aspect, you would want to be using something like Everliving here. And that's going to give you 20 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. And if you have a Shaco, you would of course use that. Next up for the chest piece, we're going to be using a mega defensive chest piece. If you have one, you would want to look for total armor percent, damage reduction against distant enemies, damage reduction against burning enemies, and damage reduction. If you can't get those, look for damage reduction against close enemies, intelligence, or all stats. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Disobedience here, so we gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds in my case, when we deal any form of damage, and that stacks up to 66%. If you're fighting bosses, then you could use the Raiment of the Infinite to get the extra damage boost from damage to close enemies and ranks into Glass Cannon. Next up we have the gloves, and we're going to be looking for something with crit chance, ranks into Frozen Orb, attack speed, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then look for something like crit chance against injured, or all stats. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of Shredding Blades here, so our Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the vulnerable duration is increased by 4 seconds. We also gain 15 to 25% multiplicative vulnerable damage. Next up, for the pants, we're going to be using Tybalt's Will here, so that's going to give us a lot of damage, some potion capacity, some maximum resource, and a good amount of damage reduction from close enemies. But most importantly, we get 20 to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. And also when we become unstoppable, we gain 50 of our primary resource, so that's really helpful to keep our mana up. If you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, you would use Mega Defensive Pants, so total armor percent, damage reduction from distant, damage reduction from burning, and damage reduction. If you can't get those, then damage reduction from close or damage reduction when injured. As for the aspect, you would use something like Snow Guards, so while within your own blizzard and for 3 seconds after leaving it, you take 20 to 25% less damage, or you would use Everliving if you don't have that on your helm. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be using Esu's Heirloom here, so that's going to give us a lot of movement speed after killing an elite, critical strike damage, and mana cost reduction, again really helpful with this build. But also our critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 30% of our movement speed bonus. So in my case that brings my critical strike chance up to around 70 to 75%, somewhere within that area. If you don't have access to Esu's Heirloom, then you would look for boots with move speed percent, ranks into teleport, mana cost reduction, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then go for Flame Shield, all stats, or damage reduction when injured. And as for the aspect, you would use Ghost Walkers. So while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased move speed and can move freely through enemies. Next up we have the main hand, and we're going to be looking for something with intelligence, all stats, crit damage, and damage to vulnerable. If you can't get those, then look for damage to close, and after that you would look for alternative damage like damage to chilled, etc. And we're going to be looking for an item with as high item power as possible for the maximum damage per second, as well as prioritizing a dagger for the extra damage to close enemies. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Ancient Flame here, so while both bonuses from the Esu's Ferocity key passive are active, our attack speeds increase by 40 to 50%, which helps us cast a lot more frozen orbs. Next up we have the offhand, and we're going to be looking for something with crit chance, resource generation, mana cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction from burning, intelligence, or all stats. As for the aspect, we're going to be looking for Conceited, so that's going to give us 15 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier. And also, just like the main hand, look for an item with high item power for the maximum amount of DPS. Next up we have the Amulet, and we're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, ranks into either Glass Cannon, Devouring Blaze, or Hoarfrost, then cooldown reduction and mana cost reduction. If you can't get those, then look for something like defensive skills. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Storm Swirl here, so we deal 32 to 45% increased damage multiplicative to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up we have the rings. We're going to be looking for Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us a lot of non-physical damage, some lucky hit chance which is nice, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. But we also get this unique aspect. For each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% multiplicative increased damage for 4 seconds, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. For our second ring, we're going to be using the Ring of Starless Skies, and that's going to give us some critical strike chance, critical strike damage, core skill damage, and lucky hit chance. But also, when spending our primary resource, it reduces the resource cost of our skills and increases our damage by 10% for 3 seconds, and that stacks up to 40%. So this is really useful in reducing the mana cost and making our Frozen Orb a lot more spammable. If you don't have access to either of these two rings, then you would be looking for a ring with crit chance, resource generation, crit damage, and damage to vulnerable. If you can't get those, then look for damage to close, or cold damage. As for the aspects, you would want to prioritize Prodigies, so using a cooldown restores 15 to 25 mana, and Umbral. You restore 1 to 4 of your primary resource when you CC an enemy. But if your mana costs are already good from your Focus, Boots, Amulet, etc., Then you could look at more damaging options, like Control, so deal 25 to 35% more damage to immobilized, stunned or frozen enemies, or Edge Masters, so skills deal up to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when cast, receiving the max benefit while at full primary resource. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. We're going to be using the green gems in the weapon and offhand, skulls in the jewellery, and rubies in the armor. Well, here we are again, at the end of another video. If you made it this far, enjoyed the video, learned something, or it helped you out in your Frozen Orb endeavour, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. It helps out a lot in growing the channel, and getting the videos out there for the algorithm. It is much appreciated, so thank you, kind YouTube viewer. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and to see you in the next video. Bye!